Welcome to Keith Knight, Don't Tread on Anyone. Today, I am proud to be joined by Caryn and Harlos. She is the National Secretary of the Libertarian Party. Ms. Harlos, where is the best place to find the collection of your research and activism?
Actually, lpedia.org. We went right into Lpedia fast, huh? Lpedia is like the Wikipedia of the Libertarian Party, so it's a dedicated wiki, and I have a page there. And actually, I have a Wikipedia page, so I've actually made it. You can find me on Wikipedia as well, but I prefer everyone to go to Lpedia.
Got it. What is libertarianism?
Wow, that you you came in firing. So what is, if you ask 10 libertarians, you're going to get 15 answers.
That's
But
why I
in
gotta ask all of them to hopefully get the right answer. Yeah.
yes, in a nutshell, it is the political philosophy that any kind of laws or I don't even want to use any kind of enforcement, laws, enforcement, government, whatever you want to call it, has to be limited to punishing or preventing aggression against another person. Now, that should be sufficient, but unfortunately, people have defined aggression so differently these days. So you kind of even have to go beyond that. Libertarians believe that inherently we only have negative rights. So what that, and if you don't, some people might not know the difference between negative and positive rights. A negative right is something that you have by virtue of being a human being that doesn't require anyone else to do anything for you. So we hear about the so-called right to health care. That would be called a positive right because somebody has to do something for you in order to get that right. They have to provide you a service. You do not have a right to anyone else's service if they don't wish to give it. A negative right, on the other hand, is like your right to life. No one has to do anything to keep you alive. The only obligation they have is not to kill you. So everything in libertarianism boils down to negative rights. Now, you and I could voluntarily assume positive rights, either contractually or just because we really like each other. But the punishment of law is limited to violations of other people's negative rights. Your hurt feelings do not count. You have a right to do with your body because you own yourself. No one has a higher claim on you than you. And of course, that goes for the person sitting in front of you. Like, it's funny, what we've kind of evolved to, because I heard your tagline, and yeah, "Don't tread on me" is a big libertarian tagline, but it's been said, and I agree, that a better one is "Don't tread on anyone," because it's not just about me, it's about everyone is equal in rights and the right not to be tread upon, as I am.
I don't know if I said "Don't Tread on Me," but the name of the show is "Don't Tread on Anyone."
I
Um,
thought
I,
you
I,
said me. So if it is, you have it down perfect.
okay, that I thought was the whole significance. Ripping off the Gadsden flag and turning it into a
Yes.
libertarian symbol. Okay. Now, with this philosophy of self-ownership, the non-aggression principle, and voluntary exchange, this is almost irrelevant to government, where we're talking about taxes and things like laws. What does this self-ownership idea and non-aggression principle have to do with government, and what makes government a unique institution worthy of all this criticism?
Well, you have to define between. I know this is getting into the weeds, but there is a difference between government and state. Government exists everywhere, and government is inevitable. At its most basic level, there is a form of government within a family between parents and children. If you go to a church, there is a church government. When we criticize government, we're not criticizing those things, most of which are voluntary, except for, your parents. You don't really choose that, but you can leave fairly quickly. The state, however, is the institution that claims a monopoly of force or of rights enforcement over a given territorial area. The problem with that is, I, the problem with that is one of consent. You don't consent to something just because you happen to pop out of a vagina at a certain latitude and longitude, but that's in fact the way it was treated. We try to pretend here that it's with the consent of the governed. And I love when people say that to me because I say, I don't consent. Now what? Simply being born here is not consent. Just like simply going to a party and wearing short skirt is not a consent to be raped. We understand that in every other area of life. We need to understand that when it comes to government as well. So when it comes to taxation, that is theft. If the person does not consent to have that money that I earned with my body and my time, I do not consent to have you steal it from me, and I certainly do not consent with the way you're spending it. So
Sure.
yeah.
Look, let's take that example of taxation and applying it to consensual activities. Everyone knows taxation exists. It's everywhere. It's just, if you know the English language, you know the word taxation, it's here. If you don't like it, well, you can either work within the system to maybe get it diminished or changed or altered, or you can move ultimately if you don't like it. Therefore, you choosing to stay here by your own free will is an expression of consent. How do you respond?
Again, that would be like, say, nobody would buy that excuse if you said to somebody who owned a business that happened to be in a mob area to say, well, if you don't like the mob, you could just move. Nobody would blame the victim in that way. And nobody should blame the victim in this way. So I don't find that valid. If somebody is doing wrong, you do not blame the victim. And the person themselves is the ultimate arbiter of their own level of consent. If I say I don't consent, I don't consent. And no move to Somalia argument is going to nullify that. I do not consent. I was born here. I have the right of any human being to stay where I was born if I wish to, and I'm not committing aggression against anyone else.
Why is it that that only applies to us? It's like, see, whenever Republicans and Democrats are criticizing the world around them, well, they're just being active in their community, trying to change the world for a better place. But if we don't like something, well, then we need to move to Somalia. Why is there that blatant double
Well, you
standard?
know what I say to that? You're the one who likes the government so much. Go move to North Korea.
Yeah, yeah.
You know?
I'm sure the government isn't big enough for them in North Korea. They
Yeah,
got
I'm
to.
not the one who sucks. You leave.
Exactly. And it's never that in hindsight. So they'll never be like, Rosa Parks really should have moved. People who were, Lysander Spooner, the abolitionist, instead of whining about it, should have moved. Where you can't get the post office you want. Where you don't want to abolish slavery that's existed everywhere since the beginning of time. He should have moved. So in hindsight, they're so objective and rational. But when it comes to today, it's so difficult for them to apply the standards we all hold to each other to this group called the Congress group. Why do you think people have such a difficult time taking principles that you and I would have if you and I were engaged in a trade and then extending that to this group called the government group?
Because we have not been taught any differently. And from the time we could, unless you were unschooled or homeschooled, the chances are, the government schooling system was unabashedly, when it was started, had a purpose to create citizens. And it's done that job really well. That might be the only thing it's done really well, is to create citizens. So we've had that inculcated in our brains. We're never taught to question that. We're taught to question a lot of things, but not that. This idea of democracy, like, that as long as 51 people say it, the other 49 got to buck up, buttercup, is almost sacred. And we don't even think to question it, in the same way that the divine right of kings used to be unquestioned. People would look at you agog back then if you said, what do you mean this one guy, just because he has a certain father, gets to rule over us? They go, it's always been that way. So yeah. It's no different. Those were human beings back then. We're human beings now. We're just brainwashed in a different way. And it really is a shock to the system to get out of that mindset. And I'm sure there are other examples. There are people whose minds have been open to other things that, other people, don't realize. People who have been in religious cults all their life, all of a sudden go out in the real world and realize that, average people aren't actually Satan incarnate, and they're shocked. You know, they didn't know any different. So I think it's a bit like that. I don't blame people for it because they were raised that way ever since they were little babies.
Sure. You have said that I am a radical abolitionist when it comes to the state, and I will call it what it is. What does it mean to be a radical abolitionist with regards to the state?
Just to give the context of that quote, I was given a talk at an anarchist group, Liberty on the Rocks, and one person was upset with something I had said. I don't even remember what it was I said, but I guess he found it might be offensive to some people who don't agree with us. And I said, I'm not going to cry any rivers for people committing aggression against other people. I said, and that is what the state is. And just like the people, you know, the abolitionists in the South did not shy away from calling slavery what it was. And back then, people pussyfooted around that issue because it was a sensitive issue. And there were a brave group of people who's like, no, I'm not going to play that game. I'm going to say exactly what it is. And so similarly, I do not believe the state is legitimate. I believe it is oppressing every single person under its alleged illegitimate authority, and I will call it for what it is. And that it's an oppressive mob that is absolutely illegitimate. And I'm not going to pretend otherwise. I'm not going to do the, oh yeah, but the government, you know. No, I'm not. And I'm using their government and state interchangeably, where I'm really not opposed to government when it's voluntary, you know, but most people don't make that kind of distinction. When I talk about the state, people think I'm talking about Colorado. No, that's that's not what I'm talking about.
Exactly. Now, you can have sort of the analogy of I'm an abolitionist with regard to slavery and the state, and it seems like you're sort of being hyperbolic. State is, you know, having to stop at stop signs. Slavery is evil institution. Well, I mean, as bad as it is to be enslaved, it's presumably worse to be murdered, and the state is the number one cause of murder and theft and genocide and kidnapping under the guise of victimless crimes and impoverishing people with regulations and currency inflation. So I actually don't think it's too much of a stretch
I don't
to
find
call yourself an
hyperbole at all.
abolitionist.
I
Yeah,
don't find, not even getting into murder and stuff like that. First of all, one person doesn't get to say to another one what value they should put on what right.
hmm
And even back in the South, there were some African American people that chose, allegedly, I don't, you know, chose is very wrong there, but some that chose allegedly to remain with their masters. They were older, they liked the white people they were with and felt it was worth it to them to have shelter and not venture out into the busy world. But that was their right to do that if they wished. To some people, the fact that they can't, you know, live completely off the grid, which is illegal in most places, is like a fate worse than death for them. They want nothing but to go out in the woods and be alone. While to other people, it's like, that wouldn't bother me that much. Or you hear women talking, and this is going to provoke some controversies, but to some women, getting raped is the worst thing they could possibly think of. I can think of worse things for me. I will not tell another woman what she should feel. I respect that, but I can think of a lot of other things that I would find worse, including murder. But I have no right to tell other women they are wrong. And so when it comes to the predations of the state, I don't get to say it's hyperbole. I know that it rankles me each and every day that we are, in fact, the property of the state. I don't find it at all hyperbole. Let me give you a personal example. Because of the state, I have spinal stenosis. Fortunately, knock on my wooden desk, it hasn't flared up in about 6 years. But when it flares up, it's like I am living with Drogon the dragon on my back. But the state, in its infinite paternalistic wisdom, has decided I can't get a daily prescription of a pain medication the way I used to when I was younger, and it controlled my pain. I live in fear every day that it's going to flare up. and I'm then condemned to a life of pain or to go out and buy illegal drugs and risk getting put in a cage for it. Fuck the state. What right does it say, oh, you might get addicted? Well, that's my choice. I would rather have a monkey on my back than the dragon that will be there. That's not their right. And we should be indignant about that. Or if we were to get into a war, you're a parent and you have a young son that has the world before them, and the government can say, we're taking your son? Fuck them. So no, it's not an exaggeration whatsoever.
I certainly agree with with all those points. Now, if I look at libertarianism from a very distant view, I might think, well, very often referring to the great innovations of free market societies, saying, well, South Korea is richer than North Korea, West Germany, East Germany, this kind of thing. So really it's about, making money and having a lot of stuff, so everyone ends up getting a lot of stuff. What would you say to that person, and introducing them to the moral case for libertarianism as opposed to a materialist economic point? How would you convey to them the moral principle that people should be free and own themselves?
Well, again, I will always say it comes down to consent. That is ultimately the moral argument. To me, it is the philosophy that is of the utmost respecter of the humanity in every single person and their right to self-determination. And if they want to surround themselves with stuff, that's fine. They're free to do that. And if somebody else is more of an aesthetic or a minimalist, they're also free to do that.
Definitely. People will often say things like, oh, well, it's not that big of a deal. Some taxation, some regulation. If you want to go out and do something right now, no one's stopping you. There's no gang stopping you from, going out and achieving your dreams more or less without a couple, little burdensome things. However, if you just apply that immediately to yourself, all right, before you do anything, you just have to get my permission or the permission of me and my friends. They immediately see that as ridiculous. Before anyone starts a business, they just have to get permission from Amazon, and Amazon will issue them a license. Immediately, you could see that's one group trying to violently dominate another, totally immoral. How do you get someone to go from seeing government as a mechanism for society achieving its ends to what it actually is, a group of people claiming the right to rule other people arbitrarily?
Well, I say to them, ask them, there's a leap that is made that most people don't think. Like there's a missing step when people try to legitimize the government, is groups don't have rights. So this group called the government can have no greater rights than any of its single members. You couldn't go next door with a gun and say, I'm demanding tribute. You're going to pay me a certain percentage of your wages. If you can't do it, the government can't do it. Even if millions of people voted to say it was okay, no amount of votes counters my no, you can't have my money. I don't care if it's 2 million people that say it's okay. No, my rights are not up for vote.
That's such an important concept because so much of the current justification is, well, government gets its rights from the people, that's why they have representatives. Well, if I don't have the right to, let's just say tax, because all states tax, even though it's not the worst thing they do, if I don't have the right to go around issuing taxes, how can I delegate that right to Governor Doug Ducey of Arizona? Well, that's totally impossible. If I don't have X, I can't give X to someone else.
Right.
And if they don't have it, how does joining a group of people in a building, the state capitol, give them rights they didn't have before entering the building? It's unbelievable. I have a quote here from Murray Rothbard, an economist. He says, "The glory of the human race is the uniqueness of each individual. The fact that every person, though similar in many ways to others, possesses a completely individuated personality of his own. It is the fact that these unique personalities need freedom for their full development that constitutes one of the major arguments for a free society." Let's say I am someone who just wants to live my life and have a ton of things. However, I see the state as sometimes helping me achieve those things. Why should I consider libertarianism?
Well, just because something bad helps you, I mean, that doesn't give you the right to favor it. I mean, if I could get away with stealing from everyone, I'm sure that would help me a great deal. Like, if I could, sneak into houses at night and I was pretty sure I wouldn't get caught, hell, I probably could quit my job. It would benefit me greatly, but that doesn't make it right. If it's okay then because it benefits you, then I am not going to, anyone with that kind of justification, I'm not going to feel that safe around them. I don't think that's a moral position. Most people don't think of it. It's not like I'm saying most people are immoral. They don't really think of it. But once it's presented and you think about it, well, then you do have a moral obligation.
It is so hard to unplant that seed once you see this group of people for what it really is. So, Ms. Harlos, do you think that we are sort of in opposition to a lot of our friends, neighbors, and colleagues, and we're sort of in this ideological war? Or do you think that it's just some people have been tricked into believing something, the legitimacy of the state, and we're dealing with people who are tricked instead of totally evil?
Well, I don't believe people are totally evil. There is, like, the question before we got cut off a little bit was, I think you had said something to the fact, is there just some internal different value system, which brings up that book, what's it, The Righteous Mind, that had talked about just different inherent values. And I actually have been pondering the idea of political determinism as to whether we're just hardwired in a certain way. But if that is the fact that we are, to me, that even just strengthens the argument for libertarianism. Because why then shouldn't people who all have the same political hardwiring be in their own community of their own choice, where they all are actually consenting to a system that they all fundamentally agree with, rather than trying to force everyone into a one-size-fits-all? So no matter whether or not this is a hardwire thing or a cultural thing, either way, the best solution is libertarianism. Because if you want to choose to be under certain constraints, you have every right to voluntarily lay aside some of your rights. People do that all the time. In fact, when you enter a religious community, you do that. I mean, I have the right to go around lying to people if I want, but as a Christian, I choose not to do that. And I'm in a religious group with a bunch of other people who choose not to do that. So there's no reason why people who want universal health care and the from womb to tomb daddy state shouldn't be able to go run off and have their little stay. There's really no reason why governance has to be tied to a particular geography either. That's a relatively recent invention. If you watch that movie, The Monopoly on Violence, they talk about the way certain ancient civilizations had to work. And in fact, in Ireland, there was well over 1,000 years of that, where people lived where they lived and they opted into certain groups that they identified with. It had nothing to do with geography. So I am all for the socialists who want their voluntary socialism to get together and socialize together, be socialists together. Just don't make me do it.
Exactly. And it's not like they even have to move and go somewhere and start their own thing.
No.
It can just be done through GoFundMe. Everyone who wants to join the Ilhan Omar Universal Healthcare Group, you chip in. When you get sick, we send you money, so long as you've chipped in. I don't see why, why these people can't voluntarily acquire funds. Let's say
well,
that.
And in fact, the state is preventing people from doing that. Groups like MediShare, because Christian organizations have been doing this for a while, they have medical sharing plans, and those are getting regulated out of existence for people who want to do that. So it's absolutely crazy. And the fact is, our health costs are so high because of the government. So yeah, let's add more government. That'll solve the problem. It's like being on fire and thinking more gasoline is going to douse it.
It is. I mean, when people talk about voter suppression, they're like, It's terrible. You have to get a license to vote. You're suppressing the vote. But when you have to get 10,000 licenses to sell healthcare or medicine, well, that's just us making sure everyone's safe and healthy and secure. What the same thing applies. Of course, there's a massive shortage, which gives us higher prices in the healthcare industry than there otherwise would be because of this tyranny of regulation. Have you looked into the right to try legislation at all?
I I'm from If there's a specific piece you're referring to, no, but the general category of right to try legislation, yes, absolutely.
So, is that a possibility with the condition that you mentioned you have earlier for you to qualify under right to try?
No, because it's not, the right to try stuff is generally for people. See, they don't mind you like risking your life. It's if it's pretty certain you're going to die anyway, like you have a terminal condition.
Yeah.
So they're like, well, you're going to die anyway, so you can consent to be a guinea pig. But nothing I have is terminal. It's just misery. So no, it wouldn't apply. Right now, what I use for pain relief is kratom, which is now trying to be made illegal by Daddy State.
Is that the John Bush company that he sells? Do you know what I'm referring to?
Not at all.
I had a gentleman on my show who sells it, and I'm not sure if it's the same stuff. Well, I'm sorry that just came to me. We of course can talk about that later.
I mean, maybe they sell kratom. Kratom's sold by a bunch of people, but yeah.
So often I am having a conversation with a non-libertarian, and they'll say something that is so wildly libertarian, but then they'll never apply it consistently. So how would you speak to someone who, for example, the "my body, my choice" claim that a lot of progressives have? When I hear them say that and then advocate for the state, those of course are contradictory. They can't believe both. I think they really have their heart in "my body, my choice." So if someone says that, how do you communicate to them that their own belief, not you pushing our beliefs onto them, their own belief system demands the moral acceptance of libertarianism and voluntarism?
I don't know if you've seen that shirt that was popular for a while, but it was one of those taxation is theft shirts, and then it said "my money, my choice," which is kind of a parody on that. But it is using the same analogy, because all these things that they are advocating for are infringing in some way or another upon my will or upon my body. And they don't accept that in most other areas of life. See, that most people, though they might define what rights are, we can quibble on what rights are, but most people don't believe in infringing upon other people's rights. But they don't apply that stricture to the government. And a libertarian is someone who doesn't believe in aggression and doesn't believe there's any exceptions to that. We make no exception for the state. Most people are not, all wild about aggressing against other people, even though, again, they might define aggression differently. And I think we can always have a common point there, and we can hone down exactly what is aggression, but only sociopaths and psychopaths thinks it's good to hurt people. We just got to get down to what does hurt mean? What is actual harm?
Now, what if someone believes that it's okay in an emergency for a starving person to steal bread so they can survive? Even though theft is generally bad, it's okay in that extreme circumstance. We on Earth live in an extreme circumstance where we need a state in order to cooperate for any of us to live so we don't descend into chaos, madness, Mad Max, and wipe the Earth from existence. What do you say to that person?
Well, when it comes to a starving person stealing something in order because they're in imminent imminent threat of dying, the person they're stolen from or in the process of stealing does have every right to repel them. Now, I would think they were a real shitty person to do that if they knew this person was just trying to get some morsels of food. But if they broke into your house, stole food, and they were caught later, you would have every right to prosecute them. Again, I think you would be a bad person once you understood the circumstance. So even in that analogy, I always still have the right to say no. If I'm the one you're taking from, I still have the right to say no, no matter how you may justify it. And because I do not agree the world is in that kind of situation, I do not feel I'm a bad person to say no, because that is an entirely unprovable assertion. There
Sure.
are, there have been societies, and even now ones, that have much more freedoms than we do. People used to say before marijuana was completely legal in Colorado, oh my goodness, I mean, you would have thought we were going to have the zombie apocalypse. But I can tell you, nothing has changed here. Nothing, except for less people are in jail. The zombie apocalypse didn't happen. And now that Oregon, or was it just Portland? I think it was the whole state of Oregon, has decriminalized, user quantities of all hard drugs. The cocaine apocalypse hasn't happened there either. The last I heard, everyone wasn't snorting lines off of their desk and swinging from the chandeliers.
Yeah.
So I don't buy that. But even in a dire emergency, a person still can say no. You still always have the right not to be stolen from. Libertarianism, where some people get hung up, including libertarians, libertarianism is not a complete self-contained moral system. All it is a system about when you can use coercion or force. It's a subset of morality, but it's not a complete set of morality. The complete set of morality is the statement that says you'd be a bad person if you have enough, and this person's about to die, help them. It's the whole thing with the Good Samaritan. I don't believe in Good Samaritan laws. You have every right to walk on by somebody who's bleeding in the street. But my complete moral system outside of your rights would say, but you should help them. And you are not the type of person I would want to be around if you wouldn't help them if you could. So it's a mistake, and I think a lot of progressives take it as a complete moral system. And as a complete moral system, it would be quite cold. Good thing it's not a complete moral system.
Exactly. One thing about the, you're dying and you just need food to eat something. Well, the existence of this in no way justifies a state, someone with the only right to steal for people who need something. So notice it's a starving person versus a person that owns bread. Not
Right.
Sometimes you need to steal. Therefore, only the Catholic Church can tax people and make sure that people get food and they get a monopoly on food production. So even if you grant them, yeah, sometimes it's okay to do a little harm to do, something for the greater good in certain extreme circumstances. That doesn't justify the existence of a state or a ruling class or me enslaving someone else. Because even that, you can say, is it okay to enslave someone for 2 minutes to stop the earth from, burning into a fiery pit? Aha, so you believe in slavery. Well, no, not exactly. Let's say something that a conservative would embrace is the government needs to stay out of my religion. There should be separation between church and state. I have the right to believe in whatever religion I'd like and raise my family however I please. What would you say to someone who has that mindset and why they should consider libertarianism?
Oh, well, because, we see what's happened to religious liberty. I mean, you can say that all you want, but we had masterpiece bakers here who was forced by the state of Colorado with basically having to shut down their business because of religious convictions. They did not want to bake a cake for a gay wedding. Now, I think that's stupid, but I understand, coming from a fundamentalist background in my youth, I understand why they think that. And I don't think they were hateful for thinking that. They've just been brainwashed by bad religion, in my opinion. But I don't think they should be forced by the state. to have to do that. And all these conservative Christians, the only reason your religious liberties are being taken away from you is because you gave the government the right to do it in the first place, because you used to oppress gay people and make that illegal and make all sorts of other things illegal. And the formerly oppressed, once they get in power, can be the worst oppressors of all in revenge. It's just human nature. And that cycle will keep going. Then once the religious people get back in power, they'll be even worse than they were before. And it will keep going back and forth until people realize, don't give anyone that power and everyone can be happy.
Excellent. Yeah, you see that with separation of church and state, because you can just say, well, what if someone believes in the wrong religion? Well, so what? It's their life, it's their choice. Well, what if they spend too much money donating to their religious cause? What if there's a church shortage? Shouldn't we force people to fund churches so we know what the commandments are, so we can live moral lives? They're total libertarian voluntarists with regard to all these other organizations in every other institution in life except for the state. Did you say that you were a Christian?
I am presently a Christian. I used to come from a very fundamentalist background. I'm no longer of that stripe. I would consider myself more of the liberal tradition of Christianity, coming from something much more strict. But yeah, I've been a Christian nearly my whole life.
Why should
my adult life?
Yeah.
Sorry.
Why should Christians embrace libertarianism?
Again, for the same reasons that we said before, if they want to be left alone, if they want to be able to practice their religion in peace. But also, most Christians, I don't want to delve into theology here between Calvinism and all that, but most Christians hold free will in very high regard. Calvinists don't. Let's put that aside. And they believe that that is one of God's greatest gifts to mankind. So why don't we allow Christians believe that each and every person is an image bearer of the divine image. If that is God's greatest gift, is free will, why are you denying that to another image bearer? So I know why some Christians think they can't be libertarians, because they say, well, I think drug use is bad, or I think prostitution is bad. It's fine, you can think that. But to use the force of the state to prohibit that, well, then be fine when the force of the state is making you bake gay wedding cakes, because that's what you get.
Sure. There was a book titled, I lost it, The Three Languages of Politics by Arnold Kling. He says, I call this the three-axis model of political communication. A progressive will communicate along the oppressor-oppressed axis, framing issues in terms of the P dichotomy. A conservative will communicate along the civilization-barbarism axis, framing issues in terms of the C dichotomy. A libertarian will communicate along the liberty-coercion axis, framing issues in terms of the L dichotomy. So, very often, unfortunately, when we frame things in the voluntarism-violent sort of dichotomy, that is, of course, true and moral, it's still almost like you're literally speaking a different language. If I care only about the difference between civilization and barbarism, why should I consider libertarianism?
Because what is civilization if it isn't free men being free? I mean, ultimately, I would always argument, what's it that, who's that anarchist guy, Tucker, who wears the bow tie all the time? He says, of course I'm an anarchist. Anything else would be uncivilized. And I agree with him. So yeah, what is the height of civilization? What was the spirit behind? Most conservatives really hold the Declaration of Independence and the founding fathers in such high regard. They were motivated, though imperfectly, obviously, because there were slaves, to abide a spirit of liberty, which was unknown then. They were radical thought leaders in that we don't need a king. That was just incredible then, the leap in morality, because I do consider, though I'm not a big fan of democracy, I'm a bigger fan of democracy than I am of monarchy. That was a huge leap forward in humanity's moral evolution, I believe. And I believe something along the lines of panarchy, which is what I described earlier, where the socialists get to have their little socialist government and, whatever, each group, I can name 50 of them. To me, that's the next step in our moral evolution, to allow people to choose their associations and their destiny.
Yeah, that's so important. What about the progressives who sees things from an oppressor oppressed? This, of course, is easy for you and I to respond to amongst each other. But if you're really communicating to a progressive who says, sure, the state has engaged in evil things, I'll give them that, but it's a tool we can sometimes employ to stop genuine things. White racism oppressing blacks, straights oppressing gays, the rich people, the few with a lot of wealth and power oppressing the masses, keeping them in metaphorical shackles. If that's how I see the world, what would be your libertarian pitch to me?
Okay, progressives are the hardest of all, I think. They're not the liberals of old. The liberals of old was much easier to speak with. But if you can get into just a simple discussion of basic rights, you would have to say, to lead them to the fact that using force to make people do something that they don't wish to do, that they really don't have an inherent obligation to do, is oppressing them. But when you start saying reviewing people just as a group rather than an individual, it is really, really hard to talk to them. Sometimes with a progressive, you have to know them really well as a person to find something that they individually, not as a member of a group, really care about, and use that as a pivot point to awaken their individualism that's inside them. Because the minute you get down the group rights, you're never going to penetrate that, in my experience.
Sure. And every time you sort of come up with something, well, if socialism is inherently good or the state's inherently legitimate, then it's just a matter of trying different things and finding out the way that quote works and the right way to do it. The, analogy that's been used before is there never in all of history was a light bulb until someone figured out how to do it. That's all we're doing with socialism. We might try it 10,000 times and we might fail because we're trying to find the right way. So what? If people don't like it, they could vote each other out. If you don't have the deontological principled approach that you value so much, then I think we're always going to get screwed with that empiricism approach. As I always hear, they'll be like, "Well, the education system is why people aren't stupid," and I go, "Okay,
no,
do you think
yeah, that's why people are stupid."
And I go, do you think that's a pretty good deal for 12 years of your life? What people come out with?" And he goes, "Well, actually, it is pretty bad, but that's why we need more money." So in other words, it either doesn't work and needs more money, or it works and is good. They put themselves in this win-win. And unless we take your stance, I think we're never going to be on solid ground. I had emailed the Village, Matt. Oh God, what's his name? Do you know the church, the Village? I think it's in Texas. Matt Chandler's church. And I asked them about voluntarism, and they said, "Nah, not too interested. I mean, we need things like child labor laws." Someone wants child labor laws. They see children as people who can't consent. Therefore, it's enslavement and endangering and abusing young people who don't have agency. Therefore, the state is legitimate. What do you say?
Okay, now on that, I might not disagree with them, because I do think there is a point in a young person's life where they cannot consent. So that is something that is really going to come down to, and I know libertarians hate this, but tradition and custom does come into play. It even comes into play with property rights. We can say, oh, you got to mix your labor with the land. Well, how much labor and how much land? That comes down to tradition and custom. You can't piss into the Atlantic Ocean and say, I now claim the whole ocean. We all agree on that. Is now it's just a matter of degree. So somebody that can't consent can't enter into a contractual relationship to trade their time for money. I do think there needs to be a easy, clear path for emancipation, because the one age fits all is not, our forebears were, some of them, not that I'm advocating people go start a family at 14, 15 years old, but not that long ago, that was what people in our country did.
Mm-hmm.
And there are people whose parents are just completely crappy and they're 16 years old and they're mature enough to go make their way in the world. They should have a path forward for that. But I don't have an issue with prohibiting child labor, just like I don't have an issue with prohibiting pedophilia. Children can't consent to sex. They also can't consent to their body being used for labor. Their parents are the custodians of their rights. They cannot consent to that. So on that area, I would agree. We might quibble on the age because I don't think it's the same for each person. I know some 20-year-olds that should still be at home with their parents.
Yeah, that's fine. And well, there's people that have mental disabilities. There's people in a coma. Yeah. There's young people who are mature. Dr. Phil always says, I moved out when I was 16 and look, I'm in a good spot, but other people need to be home a little longer. That's so weird that people say, well, things are vague. We don't know what age exactly is perfect, nor do we know exactly when exploitation occurs. Therefore, the state's legitimate. When in reality, that's exactly why you wouldn't want a coercively funded monopoly. We're not sure about things. The last thing we want is a coercively funded monopoly. We obviously would want voluntarily free associating competition to decide things like that. But what are the biggest hurdles you have run into when communicating the message of libertarianism to non-libertarians?
What I find a lot of times is they'll agree in theory and then use the get out of anarchy free card by claiming, but it's just utopian. And I go, it's utopian to think that you're going to give a group of people a monopoly on force and think they're not going to become corrupt as fuck and they're going to limit themselves. That's utopia. I don't believe in nearly the utopia you seem to have. So it's usually the hand waving without serious reflection, the accusation of utopia. I get a lot of people to agree in principle. And sometimes, honestly, the biggest obstacle is not the other people, it's other libertarians. The way they respond sometimes is very tone deaf. For instance, there's a presentation I give on, but who will build the roads? When somebody says, but who will build the roads, which is so funny because I said that when I was first confronted with these ideas. I don't know what is so magical about the roads. But I figured out when people ask you that, they're not really asking about the roads. Why that's the symbol everyone goes to, but they really aren't. When people ask you who will build the roads, they're not asking you that. They're asking you who will take care of the poor people. They're asking you, but who will make sure X doesn't happen to vulnerable populations? They're not asking about the roads. No one really gives a shit about the roads. They know if necessary, Amazon would have built the fucking roads to get their package to you. So what they're really asking about is humanitarian issues. And when libertarians act like what they are really asking about is the roads and laugh at them and go, derpity derp, the same people who are building now, are you stupid? That isn't answering their fundamental concerns. And it is a noble concern to be worried about those sorts of things. So sometimes to me, the biggest obstacle is connecting with people as people with the necessary amount of non-Vulcan empathy. Libertarian, listen, I can say this because I am autistic if you didn't know, but the autism level I think in libertarians is really high. We're a bunch of autistic INTJs and we can communicate great with each other because again, we act like we're Vulcans, but that doesn't play well with your average person. I would love some huge sociological tests because I think we should be the Asperger's party sometimes. And again, I say that as an Asperger person.
it definitely attracts a certain type of person who is, willing to think outside the box, because more or less what we're saying is 99.9% of people are totally wrong, including the experts in political science and philosophy, and they've been wrong for thousands of years. Since the days of ancient Egypt, everyone's been tricked to believe in the myth of illegitimate political authority. It takes a special type of person who's okay with being hated and seen as stupid by a large number of people to accept that idea. So I definitely see where that comes off. If someone is saying that, oh gosh, I love the ideas, but I'm so genuinely worried that the poorest among us would not be represented by politicians and then taken care of, even if it's because they just want to get reelected. I'm so concerned about that I like your ideas, but I'm ditching you guys because I'm terrified of the poor not getting their needs met. What would you say to that person?
Well, there's two answers. One of them, of course, is a very just strictly libertarian answer, which is your fear does not justify infringing upon my freedom. But the more compassionate answer is, what makes you think that no one would take up that duty, that no one would care about the poor? You just expressed to me your deep caring for the poor. Do you think you're better than everybody else, that they wouldn't care as much as you do? Are you made of different stuff? Most people care very much about vulnerable people. And the government is hobbling charitable activities, with the requirements that they impose. Like, look what they did to the Little Sisters of the Poor, because they didn't want to their employees offer birth control because they're Catholics and don't believe in birth control. All of their charitable works are getting destroyed. Do you think the people they were feeding gave a shit about birth control? No, but that's the government with its social engineering. And one day, I don't like going all Godwin, and I'm not going to go very Godwin, but there was that saying that, came out of that era where, we all know it. First, they came for X group, and I didn't say anything because I wasn't X. And then they came for Y, and I didn't say anything because I wasn't Y. Then they came for me, and there was nobody left to say anything. That is the thrust of history. That will always happen. Do not give anyone any power to do something against your enemy, or quote unquote enemy, that you don't want eventually used against you, because it will happen.
Exactly. And they see that in real time. Trump, orange Führer, worst person of all time. Biden, controlled by the Chinese communists. Well, all the power you gave to Obama got to Trump, and now it's in the hands of Dementia Joe. It happens right in front of them. It's not like, well, let me tell you about a story in ancient Switzerland 1,000 years ago. It's like, turn on the news. The thing you're afraid of is happening. As far as
and
what
the fact is, with the argument of how arrogant can you be to think that everyone since all those ancient civilizations were wrong?
Yeah.
The fact is, up until several hundred years ago, and even in some areas today, slavery was a fact of life. We all think that thousands and thousands and thousands of years of human history was wrong, because it's only in very recent history that slavery wasn't just considered, that's the way it is. We find it very hard to believe, but that is how rapidly that changed. And back then, a lot of people were just like, yeah, it sucks, but slaves like the poor are going to be with us always. I mean, slavery was just a fact of life, and we don't accept that today. So it's very easy for lots of people for over long periods of time to be very, very wrong. And women, of all people, should understand that, because until quite recently, we were almost literally property.
Yeah. Now, when it comes to what convinced you and moments that just really, shook your world, was it listening to current libertarians? Was it reading books? Was it podcasting? What was it that really made you go from sort of questioning it or not believing in it to identifying as a libertarian anarchist?
Well, there's a difference between when I became convinced of libertarianism and I became convinced of anarchism, that wasn't at the same time. I actually didn't read any libertarian stuff. I didn't even know what libertarianism was. I read the LP platform and changed my mind over the course of 15 minutes. All it was the LP platform.
Really? And is that the same one that they have today?
Yes. Because I didn't even, the part I'm talking about is because I didn't even read the whole thing. I only read the preamble and the statement of principles, and that was enough. That same sitting in front of my computer, I read it, and it was like the heavens opened and the angels sang, and the next browser tab I opened was the Colorado Secretary of State, and I changed my voter registration on the spot. I don't really know of anyone else who has done that, but that's how I came to be convinced. And thank God I didn't know any libertarians, because the biggest stumbling block to libertarianism is libertarians. So I am glad that I did not discover Facebook libertarians at that time, because I would have ran away screaming.
Who are your favorite libertarians?
Because I came to it the way I did, it's only been fairly recently that I even bothered to read much libertarian stuff. I didn't think I needed to. But Rothbard, I would consider myself a Rothbardian, though he certainly wasn't perfect by any means. I mean, he's got one idea that if it were true, I would not be a libertarian. But fortunately, he was wrong on that issue. And if you're curious, it is his position that parents don't have any obligation to feed their infants. And I think that is morally repulsive and disgusting. And if libertarianism, in fact, did lead to that logical conclusion, I wouldn't have a thing to do with it, because it's monstrous. But he was wrong on that. I don't know why. Sometimes I think male libertarians like to come up with some of the most shocking conclusions for some reason. But other than that, very much in agreement with Rothbard. So other than Rothbard, I really like Nozick. I counted on him, though. I know he's deceased, but I'm telling him right now, dude, I counted on you to keep me from anarchy. Your book was supposed to keep me from anarchy, and it turned me into an anarchist, you bastard. And that's Anarchy, State, and Utopia. All the minarchists quote that book when they're trying to argue with anarchists, and I'm convinced that none of the people who quote that book has actually read it, because it doesn't do what they think it does. It's a great book, but Nozick does a little sleight of hand in there that he didn't cover his tracks quite well enough on. Also, I like Michael Shermer. The Problem of Political Authority, I think, is just a genius book.
You know what? I'm sorry to interrupt you. Humor is his last name. Shermer.
Oh, I thought. Oh, yeah, I got confused. Yep, you're right, because he's in Colorado.
I would only correct that because Shermer has done us so bad on so many issues that I can't get those mixed up.
Yeah, Isaiah 44:22 is, I have swept away your offenses like a cloud, your sins like a morning mist. Return to me, for I have redeemed you. The redemption message there really is the impetus for my life, because I think everybody is redeemable. Not necessarily, in the religious sense, but just in the fact of their humanity. So that has always been my favorite verse. It's not a typical one, but I think it's beautiful.
Ms. Harlos, thank you so much for your time and so much for your ability to communicate the message effectively and bring people on board. And thank you to everyone for watching Keith Knight Don't Tread on Anyone.
Yep, you probably did say that the first time, but thank you, yes.
Oh, yeah.